Great. So the first thing that I want to, the first principle that I want to apply is a principle that I very often apply to planning your writing process, and it goes also for your reading process, and that is to appreciate your finitude. That's the essence of planning, is to recognize that you're not trying to do everything in an instant, nor are you trying to do everything with all the time in the world. What you're trying to do is something, some particular thing, and you have some particular amount of resources to do that in. So to start us off, I'm going to give you the basic move of all planning, which is to never start with a blank page or an empty space. Come on in. Reading the literature? Yes, come on in. So please never think about the literature as a completely open white space where anything can happen, where there are so many things going on, so many texts, that you're overwhelmed by information. There's actually, I think, if anybody's doing information theory, you'll recognize that there's really no difference between infinite information and zero information, right? If you have so much information that everything is noise, you may as well just have a white space with nothing on it, right? So the first thing we're going to do to get the sense of finitude is just sort of carve up the space. And in order to relate this to some of the other, to what Meta said in the last talk on this, I'm going to turn this into a timeline. And what's interesting about Meta's way of thinking about the timeline is she'll say, well, this goes all the way back to the good old days, right? This goes all the way back to ancient times. And of course, the present has a certain kind of cutoff. So we can use that and we can say, look, there is kind of a now, and that at that point your problem stops for now. Your literature reviewing problem stops, right? So this is your first little piece of rest, right? Is that the literature is no bigger than this, right? Now it's growing, but just remember that however much growth there is going to be in proportion to the past. And most of you will be able to find some moment in the past where it's not really reasonable to go beyond in the literature, right? There's some, I mean, yes, there are some, there's still Karl Marx somewhere in the past, right? There's still Plato even further in the past, but this is not part of your literature reviewing problem, right? So you can all set a date, and so, I don't know, like if you are sense-making scholars, you might say 1979 or something, right? With the publication of the Social Psychology of Organizing in the second edition, because that's the one that counts, right? We don't go all the way back to the first edition of the Social Psychology of Organizing. We start with 1979. So now we've already really made our problem even more reasonable feeling, right? Now we're appreciating the finitude of this problem. And then we're going to do something that Meta also pointed out, right? She said, well, look, there's papers, right? So there could be a paper, and it could be any arbitrarily in the middle of these 2 points, the present and that sort of cut off at where the past kind of becomes the ancient past. And this paper is going to have some interesting features because it's going to have a series of references, which of course appears at the bottom of the paper in the reference list, right? And that list is not infinite, right? This paper has a certain amount, X amount, if you will, of references, right? And it also has a certain amount of papers before we get into the actual future, but up to the present, that refer to it. All right, so there's going to be another set of papers, and they will be out here, right? But they will be actually referring to this paper, right? And so when we're reviewing the literature, this is the universe that we are trying to understand, and it has a certain amount of content. It doesn't have what we sometimes feel it has, an infinite amount of content. So a good question is, how much literature is there, right? Can we quantify this? And there is actually a way of doing it, and I would encourage you to think in these terms. Thomas Kuhn, many years ago, I think it was in 1970 that he wrote the postscript to his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, said that a scientific revolution, when it happens, is actually a change of mind in rather few people. It could be like less than 25 people, he said. So you have a community of scholars, and there could be less than 25 people that think in a certain way about a certain topic, And a revolutionary piece of research, so even a revolution in science, will happen first to these 25 people. These are the 25 people who are going to think differently about their research, right? Think differently about the world. So I always challenge people when they're working on their literature review to make a list of the 24 or so people, maybe between 12 and 24 people, whose minds your work could potentially change, right? And keep in mind that this is a reciprocal process. So these are also some 24 people, some 24-ish people, right? Whose opinions you take seriously enough that if you've gotten something wrong, you're going to listen to them tell you that you're wrong. Right? So make a list of these people as you're doing your literature review. Obviously, there's some kind of features of them that you should be keeping in mind as you're reviewing the literature. Are they alive? Right? This is an important feature of somebody that's going to tell you that they're wrong or whose mind you're going to change. Where do they live? This is an important thing to know about them. Where do they work? What kind of position do they hold? Right? How long have they been at this? Right? What are their social relationships to other people in your field? Right? So what you want to do is make sure that you have a reasonable understanding, quite concrete idea of who these people are, so you know their names, their ages, their gender, and so forth, right? You're aware of who these people are. It'll make it much easier to write about them if you understand them in these terms, right? That they're not just names and numbers and parentheses, right? They're actually people. So make a list of those. And then you'll notice that these people will be writing papers. They will have papers published in the past, right? Be all over this timeline. They will be writing papers here. And of course, yes, you can imagine them writing papers in the future. And one of the important things that these papers can do, the ones that are being written in the future, is cite the paper that you're working on. Right? So these couple of dozen people are the people who are probably going to read your work, probably going to cite it, probably going to use it going forward, right? That's one way to keep your problem relatively simple. Does that make sense? So we're reminding ourselves that this is a finite problem. We have a finite amount of time and a finite amount of resources to solve it. The next thing I want to point out is something that Ezra Zuckerman, who is a management scholar at MIT, pointed out. Come on in. Ezra Zuckerman has written a very useful little, I don't want to call it a paper, he's put out a PDF file called Tips to Article Writers. How many of you have seen this thing? Tips to Article Writers. If you Google that, and Ezra Zuckerman perhaps, you'll find it, and there will be, of course, a link in the blog post that we send out. What does he say about literature reviews? He says, do not write literature reviews. Right? They're boring. Nobody likes to write them, and nobody likes to read them. Now, some of you are in a situation where you have to write a literature review, right? I can't tell you not to write one because your supervisors are telling you the opposite. And one of the things you have to remember, you really have to remember this, is if I say anything that your supervisor disagrees with, your supervisor is right. Right? This goes even for your research director, your department head, your dean at a certain level, right? You have to insist on things that you really believe are right, but there's a certain sense in which my authority certainly doesn't trump the actual people in your social system, right? But why does Ezra Zuckerman say, do not write a literature review? It's because what he would prefer that we do is write theory sections. So one of the things you can do is read your literature with an aim to figuring out what the theory is in your field. And we can spend a lot of time being philosophers of science about what a good theory is, but we don't have to be that. We can just be Pierre Bourdieu, for example, who says a theory is just a program of perception. Right? So a theory is what we share in a research community that gets us to see the world in particular ways, and actually keeps us from seeing the world in other ways. And so it reduces certain complexities, it focuses our attention on certain things. And a way that I like to talk about this is that a theory always gets us to expect certain things of reality. Right? And when we say reality, we mean that particular part of reality that we have access to, which is to say we expect certain things of our data, right? So if we have a theory, we expect our data to show certain things. Of course, we also, while we are expecting the data to show certain things, we're also hoping that our data will show us something else, right? That it will show us something new, something interesting, something beyond what the theory already expects. But when we're doing the literature review part, that's not our main focus. Our main focus is to figure out what do I and 24 other people, roughly, right? Could be more, could be less, but 24 other people expect my data to show. So here are 24 people who, if I explain to them what kind of data I've collected about what kind of organization, right, at what kind of time, what will they expect this data to show? And if we're reading the literature with that question in mind, what do a handful of people expect my data to show? Then we have a really good way of writing an interesting literature review, which isn't a literature review at all. It's actually a theory section, right? It's an explanation of the current program of perception, right? The framework of expectation that brings us together as a community of researchers. Right? And that will be, of course, local to each one of you. One of the things you can also recognize is, especially if you're an interdisciplinary researcher, is that you will pitch papers to different research communities at different times. So those 24 people can actually change for your different papers. But it's still a finite problem, right? That doesn't make it completely impossible to solve. You're still saying, okay, who are the 24 people for this paper? Who are the 24 people for this paper? All tricks are good and count. Certainly ask your supervisors. That gives you a great start. They will give you some names. There will often be, one of the first things you'll be searching the literature for is existing literature reviews, right? And there will be more names than that. But what you're always looking for, and we'll actually be doing a bit of work on this when we look at a particular paper, is you're always trying to find work that's actually relevant to yours. Because it's one thing just to type in search terms in a database and get a lot of results. It's another thing to discover which of them actually combine the elements in such a way that they're useful to you and to your project. Right? But that's there's certainly all kinds of, I mean, you call them shortcuts or something, but they're not. I mean, they're in no way shortcuts or cheating. Talking to people at conferences, following through on references and the things you read are absolutely legitimate ways of getting that list of 24 people, and even reducing it to a list of 13 people if you realize that actually there are only 13 people that I care about. But do remember this, right? That you're trying to find out people whose opinion you respect and who you want to respect your opinion, right? So you don't want that to be a community of 2 people, right? You want that to be a pretty substantial community. But around 24 is a nice number to work with. Because what you then realize, of course, is each of them has a little list of 24 around them, which is just kind of overlapping. And once you get all of the overlapping areas of respect, you get a real community. You get the village that it takes to raise a child, right? Are there other questions like that? But yeah, but really, I mean, I'm not actually suggesting any standards or norms for what kind of search is enough or anything like that. That's for others to decide, certainly for your supervisors to decide. What I'm suggesting is what the outcome would look like, right? And the outcome can't look like a whole bunch of names I don't recognize or just, 17,293, right? That's not a result, right? It's a result when you know who their names are, you know where they work, you know how many papers they've written, and which ones are of relevance to you. Right? Good. So let's look at what exactly we're talking about in the papers or dissertations that we're writing. One of the things I always do is I outline an entire paper. It'll, of course, have an introduction, a background, a theory, a method, an analysis, a discussion, and a conclusion, but we're not going to talk about those things here. The only thing we're really going to talk about here is one particular part of the introduction, right? And then, like I say, the theory section. Now, like I say, some of your supervisors or research directors are going to say that a theory section is not good enough. You actually need a review of the literature. You need to show that you've been meticulously through everything that's been written in your field. I would say that's kind of the warm-up to this. right? And of course, if you have to deliver that, you have to deliver it and go ahead and do it, right? But you have to get to this point where you arrive at the state of the art or the current state of mind of the collective state of mind of your field, right? And so this is what we're shooting for, and I'll be talking more about this. The actual going through of itemizing every paper that's ever been published is something that has a natural way of doing it, but not very many interesting solutions. So we'll be talking about part of the introduction and the theory section. And the part of the introduction that we want to talk about is not the part that I usually just call paragraph 1 that situates us in the world. And it's not going to be the third paragraph either, the one that actually talks about your paper. This is where you say, in this paper I will argue that, and so forth, and you outline your conclusions. But there should be a paragraph in your paper, maybe even a couple of paragraphs, that outlines the science that you're working with, that describes in general terms what the field is up to right now. And this is where you want to really just get an angle on it, and you'll be reading the literature in order to find this angle. So let's just talk about some of you again have heard this before, and this is a great time to jump in if you have any objections to it, such as the pen doesn't work. So one of them, a really standard way of doing this is what Golden, Biddle, and Locke call coherence. You're reading the literature for coherence. So what you're doing is you're saying, here's a bunch of papers I'm finding out. What I want to find out is, how do they agree? I call this a consensus reading of the literature. Right? So you'll be reading the literature. What you say is the thing that defines the science in this field, right, is a consensus. Right? We're all in agreement that sense-making is a retrospective process. Right? It's the sort of thing that you might do. And of course, if you're going to say that, then you need to search the literature for all the people that agree, but you have to have done a search of the literature. You have to have read the literature to try to falsify that hypothesis, right? You have a thesis that says that the literature has a consensus, right? So you have to be looking for people who disagree. And once you've satisfied yourself that most people in general, right, there may be some outliers, there are always some cranks and kooks in the literature, and that's always great, but that the mainstream consensus is one kind of view. And then you can spend this paragraph in the introduction activating that consensus in the mind of your reader. Now keep in mind that you have a pretty clear image of your reader, these 24 people, right? So there's 24 people, and you're going to claim to them that we in this discipline are all in agreement about this or that. Right? You want to be sure that they are going to grant you that. Right? That their reading of the literature has arrived at the same point, has arrived at the same place, right? So they're going to agree with you that it's a consensus. Does that make sense? And what you're doing here is activating their memory of the literature. You're not teaching them the literature. You've been reading the literature in order to make sure that when you address members, established members of your field, that they recognize the field that you're describing. Right? And that's what you're doing in the introduction, just reminding your reader that this is who we are, right? And we have this agreement. There's other things that you can do. The consensus is not the only approach to this. You can look at the controversy. And this is actually what Golden, Biddle, and Locke just call non-coherence. Right? So they'll say that that there's sometimes what defines a literature is that it doesn't cohere. I personally prefer this idea of a controversy, right? That it's not just that it doesn't cohere, it's that there's active disagreement, right? So that this discipline that I'm working in will be defined by a disagreement about. And let's use exactly the same example. We could either say that in the body of sense-making scholarship that I'm working in, there's a general agreement that sense-making is retrospective. But we could also have a completely different body of the literature where there's a disagreement about whether or not sense-making is retrospective or also sometimes prospective, right? And of course there's an important difference between those two literatures as far as what my conclusion is going to be, right? Because if I'm going to say I've got this example of prospective sense-making, right, then I'm either going to pitch it into a field that thinks it's always retrospective and will be quite shocked by this new discovery, or I'll pitch it into a controversy where there's already a debate about is it mainly prospective or is it just as often, sorry, mainly retrospective or just as often prospective, right? So I have to figure out what's the right way of describing this, because I'm actually, when I get to my conclusion, I will be pitching that conclusion to this particular reader that I'm thinking of, right? So again, think of your 24 readers. Right? Think about how I'm going to describe the literature, often how I'm going to describe their work back to them. Right? That's really what those 24 people are. Right? They'll be mentioned in the review. And would it be more accurate to think of them as participating in a standing consensus or in a standing controversy? And one of the things not to lose sight of when you're talking about the controversy part, right, is that the idea that there's a controversy should not itself be controversial, right? You're not trying to start a fight in your introduction, right? What you're doing is if you want to start a fight, that's fine, but then you're going to be saying there is a consensus and I'm going to challenge it, right? This is not controversial that there's a consensus, right? But it's also not controversial that we've got a controversy going on in our field, right? This issue has already been raised. There are already 2 or 3 camps. They're already fighting this out, right? And I'm going to be taking a side, right? So neither of these two descriptions of the field will be a surprise to the reader, right? Some of you know where I'm going to, but remember that this third option is there's a warning here. Please don't go there too quickly or too easily. It is increasingly an option that people don't like. People don't want to be using this one anymore. We're getting bored of it. Yet many of you are being asked to do it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The gap.
The gap, exactly, right. It's the, you describe the science by reference to everything it doesn't know about the thing you're studying. Right? So what you basically said, I'm studying this particular kind of organization. I've decided to do it in a community of scholarship that has no experience with this kind of organization. Right? And you kind of think, why? Why didn't you just choose a community that already has experience with this organization, already has knowledge, so that you would have some support and some way of starting, some place to start? Right? So there's been quite a lot of writing on this. Alvison and Sandberg, I think, have done a paper on this. Interestingly enough, some people would read that paper as actually a gap spotting of gap spotting, but it's certainly worth keeping in mind that the gap spotting approach to literature you're doing, where you come away from reviewing the literature with a kind of celebratory, nobody's done anything on this, yes, right? That's the attitude that is getting challenged these days. That actually try to come away from that kind of disappointed, right? If nobody's done anything in your field, it actually makes your job harder, less interesting. It means you have less readers, and certainly less informed readers. And your job as a researcher is way too easy now, because anything you discover will be a contribution. Right? So try to make sure that something you discover will be a contribution, but will be kind of be edgy. Will have to fit into something. And the way you do that, actually, when you're doing this, is just imagine that you have a field, right? Let's say you could have a big consensus. You could have a big disagreement, so you've got two bodies of two camps fighting against each other. And then you could, of course, conversely have a gap. So you're going to say, well, the thing that's interesting is that nobody has looked here, right? Nobody's looked here. Now that gap could also be in here, right? So it could be within the field of controversy, but nobody has looked at an organization of this kind. Okay? So what I'm going to encourage you to do when you get in that situation, instead of saying, yes, I can say there's a gap, say, uh-oh, all right, I have to fill in this gap with either the consensus we would expect to have about this organization because we haven't looked at it. So in our ignorance, what's our literature going to say about it, right? What would our literature say if it had given it some thought? Or this organization is actually right here in the, it's a decisive case, right, that might help us decide one way or the other, right? So both camps are going to have some kind of issue with it, issue about it, right? And of course then I have to, in this description, I have to get out of the gap, go back to either the controversy or the consensus, and fill it in, fill the gap in with some presumptions, right? Some expectations. Does that make sense? So by the time we've gotten through your literature, your sense of the literature, we are expecting something of your analysis.
Thomas?
Yep.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit on a field where there isn't that much consensus, rather there isn't that much controversy, since this is pretty new?
Right. So the field itself will have a great deal of consensus. Right? If you've identified 12 to 24 people, they are in a field together, there's lots of things they will agree about. Right? You're just saying that they're not going to have any particular opinion about the organization, the technology, the managerial practice, the financial instrument, whatever it is you're studying, right? So what you're saying is, here's a topic that this field, where there is this consensus or this standing controversy, that they haven't thought about yet. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, well, concretely I'm working with blockchain technology and audit.
Right.
And I mean, at least to my knowledge, the body of the literature hasn't grown enough to kind of reach a common consensus or some controversy.
Right, exactly. So the auditing literature on blockchain is really small, probably, right? But there's some body of literature within the audit community that's the relevant people who should be looking at blockchains, right? Because blockchain is of a species that we do have a big literature on, right? And so our initial hunch about what blockchain is going to be like as an object of auditing, right, has to have hundreds of years, I would think, of tradition behind it, right? So the people who are going to be looking at blockchain, the people who will be evaluating your analysis of blockchain, already have a great deal of expectations. And the question you have to is, when I describe blockchain at a superficial level, what other auditing instrument, what other auditing object does it look like? Right? So that's, I have to imagine blockchain on behalf of these 24 people in such a way that they don't have to go collect any data, so they don't have to have any empirical experience. They just have to be kind of given a description, a background description of it. Right? And as soon as you've given them that and activated their theoretical apparatus, what do they expect then? Yep.
Another question, I would like to know how you would address transdisciplinary work.
Right.
So when you're referring to even philosophy, sociology, and things that have been done in sociology but have never been applied to a field in business, for example.
Right.
So how would you address the literature?
Yeah, I would first questionably never been applied, but I'd say my basic, because usually there will be some application of something somewhere. But my basic reaction to interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research is kind of a Zuckerman rejection of the very idea, say, just don't do that kind of research, right? And then you're going to say, well, I'm going to do that kind of research. You can't tell me what to do, which I completely understand. I'm just going to say what you're doing is you're doing something very difficult in proportion to the loneliness that you're constructing for yourself, right? So if you end up really insisting, actually no, I'm bringing together this philosopher and this managerial practice, and it's never been done before, nothing like it has ever been done before, then you have a very difficult literature constructing problem. But usually what will happen is your favorite philosopher and your focus of managerial practice will have some overlap with some other philosopher that has been applied in a similar practice. And what you're trying to do is find the field that is most likely to understand how you're going to bring these two things together. And then, what you want to do is say, it's not a gap. It's actually, as soon as you begin to describe just a little bit about what you're interested in, you're going to imagine 24 people where a light will kind of go on. And they'll be...
change in perspective, actually.
Exactly. But what's going to happen is they will recognize it as something familiar. And then you're going to hopefully say, and they will misunderstand it because of that, right? So you're going to look at it very carefully. They're just sort of kind of their spontaneous theorized reaction to your superficial description will activate a certain set of expectations, right? You're going to challenge precisely those expectations. But what you've now done is you've moved us up here again, right? You've moved it into an area where they would actually begin to agree. They would think, oh, they're going to have an existential crisis, right? You can say, no, that's, right? I see why you're thinking that because you've read too much Sartre, right? But I've read Deleuze, so I'm going to tell you something else about what right? So it's going to be, what you need to do is construct these 24 people as people that have qualified, serious opinions about your subject, whose opinions you take seriously enough to want to challenge, and who could, in principle, show you that you're wrong, right? Who have enough intellectual ballast to challenge your perspective on the world. Because if you create just a completely open space where you get to say anything you want and nobody's qualified to challenge you, either because they don't understand the organization or because they don't understand the philosopher, you become very lonely. Actually, it's a quick anecdote. One of the most tragic, should be a happy story, one of the most tragic stories of a PhD student who returns from one conference, actually two conferences quite quickly, and then the summer is over and she's talking to me and she says, yeah, it was a great summer. I went to these two conferences. At the one conference, it was mostly practitioners, and they loved my theory. They thought it was so exciting. And at the other conference, it was mostly theorists, and they thought my area of practice was so interesting. These practitioners were so interesting. They wanted to hear more about that. And so I had to kind of remind her that actually you just talked to two groups of people that were not qualified to criticize you. Right? So you got a lot of enthusiasm and encouragement, but they kept talking to the part that they didn't know anything about. Yeah.
There is a lot of demand, especially with the well-reputed journals, about the contribution in terms of theoretical contribution.
Yes.
What is the contribution into it? The problem is that if we take one stance, whether consensus or controversy, that the next question is, what are you contributing into? With literature and how you are contributing in terms of theory. So how do you suggest, I think the ideal situation will be to combine all these three things and writing in a way that, okay, this has been done in a different way. What I'm doing is maybe bringing new stakeholders, new empirical data into this literature, or maybe combining a slightly different field with that field.
The thing I would distinguish between is what we might call like an additive contribution and a transformative contribution. So when a lot of people, especially people who are looking for gaps in the literature, are trying to contribute, there's actually two ways of doing it. You're looking for a gap in the literature or looking for a kind of a missing theorist, right? So they have Foucault and they have Lacan, but they're missing Deleuze, right? So I'm going to bring in the missing theorist to them, right? But the other one is the empirical gap. In both cases, what you're trying to do is construct something where your contribution kind of has to be received unproblematically as a gift, as an addition to the field. The field has everything it needs, kind of, or it has lots of things, and I'm going to add to its riches, right? Whereas a transformative contribution is one that actually forces people to see the world differently, so they can't keep doing things exactly the way they were doing them before after you made them smarter. And that's really where you have to look strictly at what is the consensus, how can I challenge it, or what's the controversy and how can I strengthen one side of it, so that afterwards we're in a different situation theoretically, right? But like I say, and this is why I have to mention the gap, right, is that idea of having a gap in either the theory or the empirical part of the field is certainly still a legitimate way of saying, here, I have a contribution to make, right? I have something you haven't thought about yet, right? But in the long run, that's not what makes for good social science, right? Because yes, there's always an organization we haven't heard about yet. There's always a technology that's been invented, right? But how are you changing the way we theorize the world, Right? That's the real contribution.